when I saw how science is made, and what my biggest takeaway is that making science is more of a social activity. It's something that happens among ordinary human beings who make decisions in meetings through their social networks, and that for us to think that by writing an article and producing this paper and then showing it to these guys who hang out in Johns Hopkins, Harvard, Yale, that they're going to go, oh, that paper's really great. And what I'm saying, that is never, never going to happen.
Welcome to the Purple Cloud podcast. Today we have a special guest, James Flowers, who is working at Kyung University in Korea. He was one of my first Chinese medicine teachers in Australia when I started studying. Welcome, James.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. Thanks for having me.
And it's the second time on the program. And as an introduction, James was an inspiration to me to get into the academic side of Chinese medicine. And when he moved to Beijing, I moved shortly after. And then he left for Korea. And I've invited him on the program today because I'd like to discuss with him Chinese medicine in Australia, the history of Chinese medicine in Australia, and how he sees it today and in the more recent past. Yeah, James, I'd like to ask you what led you to start to research this in an academic way.
Well, before I start, you made a comment there about how partly inspired you to get into academia. But I used to,
for sure.
I used to tell all my students to become an academic, and that was very futile. And I think maybe only 2 or 3 of you ever did out of hundreds of students. So you're one of the 2 or 3 that actually took the jump. But anyway, that was a little detour. But so this project is quite serendipitous because it's not my main field of research, because all of us, when we're going to become a historian of medicine, we're thinking about China, right? And then I thought about China, then I thought about Korea. And then, so there I was in Johns Hopkins when I was doing my PhD, and I was nearly finished. And then one of the professors there, or one of the teachers there, asked me, can you write about the diaspora, the Chinese diaspora? And I said, that's really not my topic. I write about Chinese medicine and Korean medicine, and meaning in China and in Korea. Then, and then, so the professor's name is Guo Huiying. She's a Taiwanese professor of history. So she was quite disappointed, and then she thought, sure. Anyway, she persuaded me to think of a topic. So obviously I thought of Chinese medicine. And so since she wanted me to write about the Chinese diaspora, I said, well, let me write something about Australia. So it led me into my side project, which was to write an article which actually got published last year. So the article's title is Chinese Medicine Doctors Healing Australians on the Front Line of Healthcare from the Colonial Period to the 21st Century. But it's a very weird project because I did all of it without actually setting foot in Australia, because I started it in 2019, and then I was hoping to go to Australia to do research, but obviously Scott Morrison wouldn't let me in the country for 2 or 3 years, so I never made it back. And so I did all of it online research, which means that I think that it's pretty inadequate, meaning that I couldn't get to see clinical case records. And so what I did instead was write a social history of Chinese medicine in Australia. And in the social history, meaning I actually don't know how the doctors treated patients, but that's okay. But what I found interesting and surprising, even I was surprised as an Australian, right? And as an Australian who's half Chinese, even I was surprised that how much I didn't know about our own history. And actually I felt really, really excited to find what I did find. So basically, what I argue is that the history of Australia is very different to what we think it is, and the history of Chinese medicine is very different to what we think it is. So basically, I argue that Chinese medicine was very, very visible and a very, very important part of Australian life from about the 1850s onwards, and it gradually became more and more integral in Australian communities from the 1860s right up until the 1950s, meaning that Chinese medicine clinics were a part of everyday life. And having been trained in Australia and been teaching Chinese medicine in Australia, I hadn't really thought much about this history. And so it made me realize that we're pretty late. So we always think of ourselves as pioneers. Oh, we're the generation that started Chinese medicine in Australia. And then I realized it's actually not even true. We're about the third or fourth generation of practitioners in Australia. And when I say right up until the 50s, I guess that the numbers started to decline in about the 1930s because of what we call the White Australia policy, but basically the Immigration Restriction Act, which we popularly call the White Australia policy. So the numbers started to decline. But probably in the 1910s, 20s, and 30s, every town in Australia, there was a Chinese medicine clinic and a herbalist store, and we think that a lot of people. No, what I found from my research is that I would argue that probably the majority of Australians went to Chinese medicine at some time in their life, and a lot of Australians saw Chinese medicine as their main port of call for healthcare. So that's why I subtitled my article under front line of healthcare. So it's not complementary, it's not alternative. I'm saying that Chinese medicine was as important as what we know as Western medicine, and there are reasons for that. And one is that Australia was biomedicine and Western medicine was not really well established because being a colony, and we didn't have universities to train Western medicine doctors until I think the second half of the 19th century. So what does that mean? How do people get healthcare? What do people do? So it turns out that there are all these herbalists all across Australia. So we know, so why I'm saying this is important for at least two reasons. The first reason is that when we think of the history of Australia, we don't usually think of it as a history where people, Asians or Chinese and all kinds of people were active in communities. And so when I started this, I contacted my old friend, Michael Williams. And Michael Williams was an old buddy from back when I used to live in Australia. And since then, he's become an adjunct professor at Western Sydney University. So he works on the history of the Chinese diaspora in Australia. And then I really found his work useful because what he shows is that what Australians have done is whitewashed the history of Australia, meaning that we imagine Australia where mostly white people were hanging out here. And of course, maybe the majority was white, but the communities didn't. The communities were actually vibrant communities where there was a Chinese community there and that there was a lot of interaction. And so what Michael Williams also argues is that the image that we have of a hostile white community that carried out massacres on Chinese and that, always discriminated against Chinese, he argues that this is exaggerated. And here it's a bit sensitive because some people would argue that we can never exaggerate racism and hostility towards Chinese. But on the other hand, as historians, we want to show the agency of people who live fruitful and active lives and who do not need to be depicted in history as victims. And so what I'm trying to say in my article is that the Chinese community were not only victims, that many Chinese belonged to the elites, Australian elites, and among those elites, there were not a great number, but a substantial number of Chinese doctors. And when we say Chinese doctors, we think of maybe when I'm talking, people will have an image of some kind of rustic, kind of guy from a village in China who comes along with he's read a few books and he decides to set up a clinic and sell some herbs. But what we find is that many of these doctors were highly educated, and what this speaks to is I really agree with Michael Williams' argument. So Michael Williams shows in his book, he wrote a book on the diaspora in Australia. The name of the book is Bound for Glory. So if you're interested in Chinese Australian history, read Bound for Glory. So when he says Bound for Glory, he's talking about many of the Chinese people who came to Australia came for glory, meaning that they were very high achieving elite people. And so most of us, not most of us, but even the Chinese community themselves, they like, in Chinese history, if you read history books, they always tell you there are two reasons that Chinese came to Australia. One is, there was war and revolution in China, so people couldn't live, and so it was disastrous, so they had to leave. And then they came south, and many ended up in Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, and some came as far as Australia. And the second reason is that, because of gold, so the Chinese were interested in gold. Well, yes, of course, some were interested in gold, but many of the Chinese who came to Australia were not necessarily coming because of these reasons. Many just thought, well, I can continue my profession in another country. So many highly successful, highly educated Chinese medicine doctors moved to Australia with the idea that they could bring Chinese culture and Chinese medicine to Australia, and they thought they could be successful, and many of them were. So that is that's the general theme that I talk about. And secondly, so I'm just backtracking. So my point is that Australian history is very different to what we often read about in history books, and it's very different to how people generally in Australia think of it, because most people in Australia think, we're a multicultural society now, and it's all, we have this Chinese community, but this is not new. It's not new. And then secondly, if we think of the history of Chinese medicine, so when we think about Chinese medicine, we think about Chinese medicine usually in China. That's how we usually think of it. But now historians there's a new book by Tamara Bennett Shelton, who wrote a book about Chinese medicine in the United States. And so no one's written a book about Chinese medicine in Australia, but I think and there are some scholars who have written about Chinese medicine in Australia, so I'm not the first. So please don't misunderstand me. I'm not the first, and a lot of what I wrote I actually got from other scholars, and I do cite them because, as I said, I couldn't go to Australia. But I do make I think is a new argument that other people did not make. So my argument is that Chinese medicine was actually much, much more significant than we think. And so in Australia, so that means that, so Daniel, that in the Chinese medicine field, people talk about how, in the 20th century in China, people like historians like Sean Lay talk about how Chinese medicine encountered the state, and because it encountered the state, it had to change and it had to almost become scientized and adapt. But then, what about the Chinese medicine doctors who are not in China? What about those who are in many countries like Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, all over the world? So they were not constrained by the Chinese state. So if we really want to see how Chinese medicine developed outside of China, then we get a different story. And so what I'm arguing is that Chinese medicine is not just a Chinese phenomenon. Chinese medicine is a global phenomenon. And so that changes the story of how we think about Chinese medicine. So it's not just in China. Then secondly, oh, now I lost my train of thought there, but
you mentioned, I think you mentioned in your article that Britain, there's some evidence that perhaps it was not as popular in Britain. I've not read this book you mentioned about Chinese medicine in America either, but in the English speaking world, they're the two places that obviously will come to mind as where Chinese medicine was practiced. And I'm just wondering, is Australia's identity as this sort of colonial outpost, is that the sort of factor you think made it somewhat different to both Britain and the US, or are there some similarities you've come across in the practice of Chinese medicine in these areas?
Well, that's a good question. So before we went live, I'm not sure if you're going to put this part where we're discussing about how in the Chinese medicine world, how
we can bring it up again. We can talk
well,
about
I'll
it now.
talk about that. So I'll say how North America centric the Chinese medicine world is.
I'll just say I agree with that, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to do this podcast. Is a lot of the stuff I see online, I feel has this undercurrent of there's. I just notice people don't really seem to know what's going on in the rest of the world, and there's a bit of a lack of interest in that. But you've got a spin on this as well, that it's Australia's fault in a way.
It's not a spin. I argue it's true.
Okay.
So the way I argue is true because if you look at Tamara Bennett Shelton's book, she herself says so in this book, Tamara Bennett Shelton, she argues that, as I do for Australia in a much shorter version, in just an article, not a book. So she argues that of the importance of Chinese medicine in the identity of the formation of American society, so that Chinese doctors were very important characters, important figures. So similar to what I was talking about. But she also shows, she's arguing that the American society was very much integrated with this Chinese medicine experience. But she also says that at any one time in the 19th century, there were about 20 to 30 doctors in the whole of United States at one time that she could count. And even if there were many more than that, which for me, that's very surprising, only 20 or 30. And even if there were more than that, they were mostly concentrated in California, so San Francisco. And then a few branched out up to Oregon. Then we have some in Hawaii. Then we have a couple, not many in New York City, and that's about it. So even and then in the US, the Chinese medicine doctors in the 20th century were much depleted. So that in the US, it really was true that there were not that many. And when you look at Australia, so why I was surprised, because I was looking at all the newspapers online. So Australia's quite good. You can find all the newspapers online from the 19th century, early 20th century. It's a National Library of Australia, I think, it provides that service. And if you just look through the papers, you can see Chinese medicine everywhere. There are articles about doctors, little snippets and little stories of interest. So a particular doctor, he got married, and they'll have a story about that. Then they'll have a story about, oh, a doctor set up a clinic, and these are not paid advertisements. They're just stories about Chinese medicine doctors in the community. And it was really surprising because they're often on the front page. So can you imagine now if so you got married recently, congratulations. So imagine if they just put on the front cover of the Sydney Morning Herald, Daniel Spiegelman, the Chinese herbalist got married. But that's exactly what was happening. But that didn't happen in the US, and it certainly didn't happen in the UK. So that brings me to the question, why Australia? So I'm arguing, like, I'm saying that, so when you look at the Chinese medicine story, so what is the story that we always know? Oh, so there were some Chinese medicine doctors and there were some famous cases. So everyone, the US knows about Ying He, this doctor in Oregon who had a very busy clinic for about 50 years or something, but he stands out. But in Australia, he wouldn't stand out because there'd be many, many others of similar popularity. And so why Australia? So that I don't really answer that in my article, but I do ask the question. So that brings me back to, so when I first started studying Chinese medicine as a student there back in the day at the Sydney College of Traditional Chinese Medicine, Chinese medicine was very different. So I started studying a long time ago, back in the 80s. So that's a long time ago. So 1980s, wow. Late 1980s. But anyway, so at that time, Chinese medicine was not as institutionalized in universities as it is now. So that meant that the teachers were mostly white Australians who had, taken this big journey to Chinese medicine. And I think many of them were really proud that they really believed that Australia was the most dynamic, vibrant site for Chinese medicine outside of Asia. And I wasn't really sure about that. I thought maybe this is Aussies being too patriotic, as many of us are. But then, but I think they're right. I think that there's something really special about Australia. And I think it's because it's not my specialty, but having read some of the histories by people like Michael Williams, I think that Australia was really different to the US, where the Chinese community was much more visible. And maybe that's because we're actually in the Indo-Pacific. And so we're in the same time zone. And so it's much more convenient. I mean, it doesn't mean that there were of course, there are many, many Chinese people in the US, but Michael is not really arguing, but is kind of suggesting that many of the Chinese who came to Australia in the 19th century were people who are well educated. And then that comes to the question of why were Chinese able to be so successful in Australia, which goes against what most of us think about Chinese. And is it that Australians were more friendly? Michael Williams, he's not really saying that, but he's kind of suggesting that. And of course, there was the racism, but then, and I'm getting way over my skis now, I'm getting into areas that I'm not really sure about, but I think it has something to do with Australia being a young colony, and it was a British colony at the time. And so Australians did not have the sense of American exceptionalism. So if you live in the States, I mean, I did, there is this thing of American exceptionalism, which I was talking about with Daniel before we started. And so I think that Australians are probably more easygoing than Americans. And I'm being and I'm not speaking very academically because I'm just riffing off what I think. So, but anyway, so I'll stop speculating, but I will say that Australia is a much more fertile ground for Chinese medicine than anywhere else in outside of Asia. I will stand by that statement. And what that means is that for the Chinese medicine community in Australia, what I think is that we should be less apologetic, and we should be more proud of Chinese medicine, and we should know that it was very much a part of the fabric of Australian society, and that we do not need to be defensive because Chinese medicine helped Australia to become the country that it is in a very real way. If you read all the stories that I read, I mean the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of stories of Chinese medicine doctors performing these great so-called miracles.
Yeah, I think you mentioned there's I could be getting it wrong, but up to 1,000 practitioners in Australia during that time, which when you compare with 20 or 30 in America.
That's not all at once. That's not all at
once.
Oh,
okay. I must have got that wrong. Okay.
But even so, but to compare, so probably there are about 20 in the United States in about the 1860s, and or about 50, at least 50 in the Bendigo goldfields. So just one area, there are at least 50 Chinese herbalists in the Bendigo goldfields.
Yeah, that's amazing. And, we fast forward to today, and I, from reading your article and listening to you talk about it, it's a foundation where we see what happens in Australia with the national registration of Chinese medicine, where all these other alternative therapies like naturopathy did not make the cut. And that could, in a big way, be due to this more entrenched history here. And now we have, people trying to get Chinese medicine on Medicare, which is the national government health insurance, which is, the idea of that happening somewhere like America, where that doesn't exist, like it's I agree with you. I see it as a very special place, and it's taken me until fairly recently to see that, because I did spend, almost a decade in China, and it's only since coming back here and practicing here a few years ago, I did want to go and take the exam to be able to practice as a doctor in China, and COVID brought me back here. And since I've been practicing there, I'm actually much happier practicing here. I think it's a very unique environment, and it's a big reason why I wanted to do this podcast, is to help more people know what's going on, and the practitioners in Australia as well. I wasn't aware of this history, and I'm sure there's many people out there who are also not really aware of it. Yeah. So do you think there's more work to be done in this area, like field? Because you mentioned you didn't have the opportunity to do field work. Do you feel there's some field work to be done in this area?
So social history. So this chapter is basically just a social history. So I just outline what doctors were doing, and then I make an argument about the importance of the success. But I'm a practitioner, and then also a historian. So I'm very interested to look at the case records. So I know that case records exist, but I couldn't get back there. So case records do exist. So if someone was interested, they could look at the case records, meaning that they could. So what I would be interested in is a couple of questions. So I have a couple of questions. So how were they practicing? Was it similar or different to the way people practice in China? So obviously it was Chinese medicine, but let's say in the 1920s and 1930s, where historians like Sean Lay or Volker Scheidt tell us that, Chinese medicine did kind of changed or kind of adapted, but then how did Chinese medicine adapt or not for Chinese medicine doctors in Australia? And secondly, just out of personal interest, so I think that in Chinese medicine, a lot of us, we just think of China as this amorphous mass. Well, China's China, so that's Chinese medicine. But probably about 10 or 15 years ago, historians started to think about the importance of different styles of Chinese medicine. And probably one of the most important people to talk about that was my advisor, Marta Hansen. So Marta Hansen wrote a book and wrote some articles about how the difference between Southern and Northern medicine. But, okay, so what do people like Marta Hansen and Volker Scheidt mean when they talk about Southern medicine? So what we need to know is that so you know, because you were in China, but in China, there are many different regional styles. But the style that most of the scholars write about is Jiangnan medicine, or the area around like modern-day Shanghai, Nanjing, and Jiangsu, Zhejiang. So as the cultural center of China, where the elites gathered during the Qing dynasty, so much of the medicine that we think of actually is Jiangnan style. So pertaining to Australia, there's a scholar called Florence Bretel Estoblet. Well, obviously she's based in France. So she's interested in Cantonese Southern medicine. And she's working on this project about that. So I'll be very interested to see what the styles of practice these doctors were practicing. Because I think, as far as I know, I could only find doctors from one particular region from Australia, from China, which was the Toishan, mainly from Mandarin say Taishan, but Toishan near Guangzhou, but in Guangdong province. So, and it's just really remarkable that most of these doctors just came from one region. So I'm wondering what style of medicine they were practicing.
And in these records, are they in the National Library as well?
There are some in the National Library. There's some in the State Library of Victoria.
Okay, so
University of Melbourne Library and the University of New England. So they're scattered across different universities, but as far as I know, no one's looked at them. But I know they exist because I was in email contact with some of these libraries, and they said they couldn't send them to me, but they could just let me know that they were there, and I was welcome to go. But because of COVID, I couldn't.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Well, maybe I might have a look at them at some stage. I don't know that I want to commit to more than that, but I'm also very curious about the styles of practice and what they were doing exactly, because I think you mentioned in there as well, the climates are somewhat similar from south of China and a lot of Australia in that sort of hot, humid sort of climate. So the treatment style may have transferred quite well. Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah.
And how do you? I'm curious how you see, because you worked quite a lot in the field, not just in terms of being a practitioner, but also the political organizations, the AACMA, and getting Chinese medicine. I guess that's part of the job of that organization, is getting it more accepted through the mainstream, or at least more visible. I guess it's had many different roles, but having a look back on your time in the AACMA, the Australian Acupuncture Chinese Medicine Association, I should say, for people who don't know, and in terms of what the newer research you've done in terms of the history, is there anything in that time you look at in a different way, or is, comes to light in a different way in terms of what you accomplished during that time?
But broadly speaking, it's partly because I was doing this work in the association. So for people who don't know, I was the president from, I've forgotten, 2000 to 2009. So that's a long stretch, and it was a lot of work. But I think partly, and that's because I was doing that and I felt frustrated that I thought we could do much more, that I thought I needed to actually know more about the history. So in a nutshell, that's how I came to become a historian, because I was in all these countless meetings, so many meetings with all these scientists and all these people, and we'd all argue about how we're going to increase the status of Chinese medicine. And then in international meetings, I met people from all over the world. And that's where I met Japanese and Koreans and Singaporeans, and everyone had their take on how we're going to increase the status of Chinese medicine. Then it led me to think that we are not getting anywhere with these old arguments about, oh, let's become more scientific. So essentially, that's what led me to worry that some of the leaders of the so-called leaders in the field globally have this idea that, oh, let's join the establishment. And then I was thinking that, so not really knowing much about history, I still had a feeling that I think we're going to get eaten up here. And I think that we're leading us down a path that is not going to be good. And so so I wanted to know about the history. And then I thought that knowing the history would help in some way.
No, I think it could be very helpful, because I mean, most of the focus at the moment is being the research path, which I find it's necessary to communicate certain things to the wider public, and it gives a sense of, I think, making people feel reassured that it's not just complete quackery. But I think there's a big role for the humanities in telling stories and narratives and this kind of thing and fleshing it out, because that is really, I think, how most people communicate more on a day-to-day life and understand things. So I really do believe that there's more of a role for the humanities, such as history and anthropology and this kind of thing. So yeah, I think is that kind of what you realized when you're working?
Sure. So I agree with what you said. And also, so I was actually in the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. So many of the leading scientists and the medical scientists in the world, well, we became friends and buddies, and we go to the gym together and hang out together. But would they take Chinese medicine seriously? Not really, but they're very tolerant and very liberal and very, very democratic. And so when I saw how science is made, and what my biggest takeaway is that making science is more of a social activity. It's something that happens among ordinary human beings who make decisions in meetings through their social networks, and that for us to think that by writing an article and producing this paper and then showing it to these guys who hang out in Johns Hopkins, Harvard, Yale, that they're going to go, oh, that paper's really great. And what I'm saying, that is never, never going to happen. Why? Because they're so busy. They're busy doing their own research. They have their own networks and they have their own goals. They need to write grants. They're not going to have time to sit down and get excited by a paper. So I saw it again and again and again that people, for example, like some scientists would come up with some great new paper where they've proved that acupuncture channels can be kind of stimulated through certain points, and that can help with, say, allergic rhinitis. And then, whoa, I've got this great paper, and it got published in a prestigious journal. And then all the scientists in the scientific community go, ho hum, yeah, nice article you got there. But so my big takeaway is that if we're going to achieve any change, it has to be through social acceptance, bottom up in communities. So it has to be at the level of people who live their lives. And that is the lesson I got from researching this article about China, that it's very much a bottom up phenomenon. And by bottom up phenomenon, I mean that okay, so these doctors were very active in their communities. They weren't just people who just sat in a clinic and saw patients. They also, when they participated in the charity organizations, the philanthropic organization, and they went out and met lots of people and became friendly. So they became basically these elites. Chinese medicine doctors of the 19th century and early 20th century were society elites who rubbed shoulders with people and became friends, and Chinese medicine became quite well accepted. But what happened was that not just Australia, but globally, the biomedicine profession, they actually became dominant only in the 20th century, at the beginning of the 20th century. And probably you can blame Johns Hopkins, where I was at, for a lot of that, because Johns Hopkins became the gold standard for biomedical science. So that was the thing. So being there in the heart of the beast, so to speak, and actually I had a very pleasant time there. It's a very nice place, but I saw how science is made, right? So science is made by, as I said, it's a social activity. And if you read an article by the very eminent historian of medicine, Charles Rosenberg, he argues that, well, the biomedicine profession, they organize themselves politically. And so it wasn't that they said, we've got this scientific knowledge, but they went out of their way to organize themselves into a cohesive group, and that they the state lobbied governments and said, look, we're the guys, we're the people that you have to trust. And so eventually they won out. And so that was not inevitable, because in the 19th century in Europe and in United States, there are lots of other different groups, homeopaths, herbalists. So many people don't know that the famous University of Pennsylvania, UPenn School of Medicine, that was originally a homeopathic hospital.
Oh, wow. I didn't know
that was
that.
a homeopathic hospital until the 19th century. And so it kind of flipped in the early 20th century. It all flipped. And so all these other groups just got marginalized, right? And that included Chinese medicine. So that happened in Australia. So even though Chinese medicine doctors were still active in the community, so then it became Chinese medicine doctors could not join institutions. So what I think now is that, so this is not academic, I'm just speculating again, but
That's okay.
It needs to be a social dynamic, meaning that we need to become seen. Chinese medicine needs to be seen as something that is valuable, but communities need to see it as valuable. And I believe that probably in Australia, many communities do see it as valuable, but we need leaders in the community to crystallize this experience and then present that back to communities in a way that it can create this rolling wave effect where we have this feedback where we put it back. So that, as you said, we have stories, and then we have a narrative. We have this. So we need to capture the social imagination, but we're not doing that. And so I would like to try to help to do that, but
Yeah,
but
well, me too. I think this podcast might be a start, but we can brainstorm other ways to do it. Another thing I'd add, which is somewhat relevant, is I don't know how many people are aware of the replication crisis in scientific research in that, and it's especially pertinent. It's a lot psychological research, but medical field in general is a lot of the research can't be replicated, which is, a huge issue. It's a huge issue. And I think, if you're looking for Chinese medicine research, there's all kinds of issues with it. I find it doesn't fit into the model of research really well. Like, you can research a particular herb, but when you start to have a formula, you've got all these things interacting with each other. So it gets to be almost infinite sort of interactions. How do you start to measure that? And how do you diagnose it? Do you use Chinese medical diagnosis or Western medical diagnosis? And then they have these sham acupuncture needles if you're doing acupuncture research. And I mean, they're still stimulating a point. The person thinks a needle is going into their skin, so it is interacting with the nervous system in some way. So I don't know a good way to construct research. I'm not research minded, but there are a lot of issues with trying to fit it into this model as well. It doesn't fit so neatly because it's coming from a completely different background. So this is another reason, and not that it's impossible to do, I'm saying, but it's just it doesn't fit so neatly. Whereas with the humanities, perhaps there's more space to take it on its own terms, I think is what I'm saying.
Yeah, in the scientific world, because there are hundreds and thousands of researchers, right? So the question is, does it mean that all research is bad or good? Okay, it doesn't mean that. It means that what research that the leading scientists decide is good. And how do they decide that? How do they decide that is good? So for the lay person who thinks that, scientist is objective fact is just not exactly true. It's not exactly true, right?
Mm.
So, and then back to your point of Chinese medicine, the big problem is that we like to talk about individualized medicine, individualized cases, and then can we universalize treatment? And we can, for the purpose of verification or authentication by a state body or an institution, but on the ground, in reality, we like to individualize cases. And that comes to the conundrum or the paradox that now biomedicine is moving towards this goal of precision medicine or individualized medicine. And so even in the biomedicine world, there's huge debates and arguments about what and how valuable are RCTs. And as I keep on saying, I was in the heart of the beast in Johns Hopkins, where
RCTs being randomized controlled trials.
people have gone way past RCT.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, like in what way?
Because people don't know that people are interested in precision medicine. So when doctors make decisions on what to do, they don't necessarily refer to this RCT trials, and they don't necessarily refer to such and such treatment. So what RCTs are useful for is pharmaceutical companies, because you want to authenticate a medicine, and that's fine. So that's accepted that you need to authenticate a medicine, but treatment and therapy is becoming more and more individualized, or that's the goal. And so therefore, RCTs are kind of a bit passe, because everyone knows that if you want to, we're going towards biological medicine, which is nanobiological. So it's becoming like microbiomes, and then it's becoming genomes, and then, but I'm not looking down on Korea, right? Because I live in Korea and I like Korea. But then when I come to Korea, I get surprised because people are still back where, say, Johns Hopkins was 20, 30 years ago, where, because in Korea, people still talk about RCTs and EBM and evidence-based medicine, and that's not the language that people use in the US anymore. So,
I think in Australia they do too. I'm not 100% sure, but I think it's still not there yet. I mean, I have heard when I did work in a hospital, yes, there was a push towards individualized medicine. I did hear that, but evidence-based medicine was still a big thing. That was a few years ago now.
So coming from Australia and coming from China and Korea, I was mildly surprised that, so in Johns Hopkins, there's more of a critique of EBM. It's oh, you're 20 years ago, man. I'm simplifying stuff, but what I'm saying is that the scientists understand the limitations of it. And then, so if scientists understand the limitations, why are Chinese medicine people just limiting themselves to this narrow goal that scientists think is a problem? And
is it scientists or doctors? Is it researchers? Both of
research,
them?
so the medical science community.
Okay, wow.
Because they're both, because many people are scientists and doctors.
Okay.
So like, Tony Fauci, like he sees patients, but he's a researcher. So.
Yeah, okay. Interesting. Yeah, that's very interesting. Because I think I'm imagining the replication crisis has something to do with this, because they're realizing that it doesn't always translate perfectly to the real world. This sort of research. So what do you see? It's a bit of a out there question, but getting back to Australia, the future of Chinese medicine in Australia. I mean, you've not been here for a number of years, I understand, and you've researched the more distant, somewhat distant for Australia in recent past, but do you have any idea where you see it heading, or where you would hope for it to be heading?
Yeah, so I hesitate because I feel like an imposter because not living in the country, right? But I'm invested in Australia. I think about Australia, so I can offer some thoughts. But on the proviso that, well, I'm a bit of an imposter because I'm one of those people who left the country, right? So
where would you hope for it to go?
One of my pet rants is how the English speaking community and the Chinese speaking community kind of speak past each other, and they don't really connect with each other. And so, because I know there's a larger community of Chinese speaking doctors or Chinese medicine doctors who speak primarily Chinese at home, and maybe a mixture of Chinese and English to their patients. And then I feel, okay, when I was in AICMA, one of my major pet goals, one of my major aims was to bring these two communities together, the Chinese speaking community and then the English speaking community. And I think we made quite a lot of progress, and at least we had a lot of joint events and functions, and we got a lot of people became friends and communicated with each other, and learned that the way that people thought of Chinese medicine in the established places like UTS and Western Sydney University is probably a little bit different to how the Chinese speaking community thought. So one thing. So the first, I would hope that these two communities cannot think of themselves as separate, and they can think of them as, well, we're all Australians. So I hope that that could happen. And then secondly, Chinese medicine education, I think is a pretty disappointing that UTS, University of Technology, Sydney Chinese Medicine Department, well, it's finished. And I think that's pretty disastrous. But it doesn't mean that we need to lose hope. It doesn't mean that we still have, well, we still have other institutions where people can learn Chinese medicine. But back to my original point, I would hope that our education changes, and I would hope that we teach our students to become people who are active in the communities, meaning that we teach them humanities, and we teach them history, a bit of anthropology, and we teach them to think historically, and so that we train new generations of practitioners who understand the world differently. So, and what I mean is that many of the institutions, they train people they have a toolbox of what they think of as the necessary skills to treat patients, right? But I think of education as more of a whole experience where we need to transform our new Chinese medicine doctors, not just as people who learn a skill, but as people who are transformed by the philosophy and by the thoughts that underpin East Asian medicine. So that means going into historical. That means knowing more about history, and it means knowing that stuff like Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism.
Philosophy as well is very big. Like when you start to realize,
and it doesn't mean that we learn them just books, so we just read a book and say, oh. It means that we really transform as people. So instead, I understand that in universities, you need to learn courses like diversity training and then some communication skills. And I think that they're very generic, but it's not what is going to help us as Chinese medicine doctors. I think we really need to learn how, for example, a person like Sun Timiao we need to actually imagine ourselves as these doctors. So we learn that how they thought, how they lived, in what context they lived. And then, so the doctors that write about in this article, we need to identify with them and know the struggles they went through. And that means knowing some humanities, knowing some training and understanding our role as doctors is not just to treat skills, our role is to transform communities. And to transform communities, we need to transform ourselves. I'm sounding like I'm preaching now.
No, I think it's a powerful message, because the process of learning Chinese medicine for me has been changing the way I see the world, the way I behave, all of this, what they would call self-cultivation practice, but also the way I think, all of this kind of stuff. I think the way I think as well is probably I'd say the most important, because it teaches you to be flexible in clinic, and it's just a different worldview to this. We're brought up with this sort of materialist scientific worldview embedded in us, whether we know it or not. And it's kind of, when you learn this, we should be unwinding this a little bit, or at least questioning it, or developing a different worldview to sit beside it. And I think I think this is what you're talking about. But then you can bring that into the clinic, but it's not immediately usable. Like you go and you learn some points and be able to put the needles in. It's not like that. So it's not this immediate clinical practical use, but I think it's actually in the long term more valuable in clinic than learning a few tricks on a weekend course.
Well, you sat in some of my lectures when back in the day, so you remember what I used to talk about. So I used to
It was a long time ago.
but you were actually one of the people who were listening, and then I asked everyone to write essays or homework, and you used to write about that. And I remember I gave you A's, but but I remember that. But you probably remember that there were other students who hated when I used to talk about that. And I'm sure you remember that. Some students pushed back and said, just don't teach us this crap about self-transformation, and just teach us the skills, teach us the points. And so if I was in a position in an educational institution, I would insist that students go well beyond this idea of, oh, we're learning a few skills. So that comes back to your question of about 20 minutes ago, where you said, oh, so what all you just said, all of that I agree with, but also we need to be transformative in the community. So what I think is that we need people who are spokespersons for Chinese medicine or East Asian medicine, and people who can be good communicators in the broader Australian community. So people who might, have a really good media profile or something like that, or who write articles that get published in newspapers. And that is, I think, what we're lacking. That because most of us, we talk to ourselves, and we talk to our patients, our families, but we're not reaching the wider community. And that could be because mainstream media doesn't want to pay much attention to us. But now we have things like Purple Cloud Podcast, where I think you're trying to do that. But I think more of us can make more of an effort to reach out to communities. I remember when in ASMA, some of us did this media training.
Oh, yeah?
Sorry, I'm laughing, but I'm laughing because it was pretty ridiculous. So these TV consultants came in and told us how to appear very, appear very convincing, media interview. But I think now looking back, at the time even I thought it was ridiculous, and because we need to be ourselves, we need to be natural. It's not something that you get trained to do, to say, oh, and then put on a nice smile. And it's like, yeah. Anyway, my point is that we need to connect. So here's the word: we need to connect with communities, and then inspire the public imagination. And that's how I would hope that's where I hope we can get to. And that's the point of my article, where about these Chinese doctors in the 19th century, that they actually did inspire many people through their force of personality. And I think that these doctors who did that, what I saw in some of them was that they had this compassion that they carried with them in their daily life, and this kind of, the word you use the word self-cultivation. So when we practice self-cultivation, we bring that to bear on communities as a whole. And so I would like to see an Australian community, Australian society, where Chinese medicine people are people who with public profiles in Australia. When I used to argue that back in the day when I was in ASMA, I actually used to argue that then, and I got pushed back from most people because they thought you're going to get up yourself. We're just going to stay in our own little bubble. People would literally argue that, and I think that is because of this faux or fake elitism, where people think that, oh, I'm very precious, and I know Chinese medicine. I have this special knowledge, but I think it's only special knowledge when you can communicate on a level with a large proportion of the population, and I don't think that's being up yourself or.
No, and especially like, I mean, once you, yeah, no, I agree. I mean, when I see in clinic, you see how you can be of help to people. And, when you're in this profession, you get a lot of cases where you're the last port of call, like someone's been struggling with something for a long time. They've seen all these medical, and then it can often be a very simple treatment from a Chinese medicine perspective. It's not difficult to diagnose. It can be, so there is really something to offer, I think. Like there's a number of roles I feel it can fulfill in society very easily. And in order to get that information out there or to change people's, or just make them more aware of it, I don't think that's necessarily has to do with anyone's ego at all. It's fulfilling, like you say, a greater public good and is good for the community as a whole. Yeah.
The problem is that there are some people who operate out of ego. So there's
100%. We've talked about
there's the paradox.
Yeah.
So there's the paradox to become a public person without an ego, and that means following the Confucian sages of being humble and following this path of self-cultivation. So there's the trick. If we can have a cohort of people who understand this, and I'm sounding preachy again, but I think that's a good goal. That's what I think.
I agree. I think it's a good goal as well. On that note, we might wrap it up. We've been going over an hour, so that's
Sorry.
no, it's good. We're having a good conversation. No, sorry,
Talking too long. I don't know.
No, not at all. Some podcasts go. Of course. Well, they should be. They should be interested because it's interesting, at least to me. But it's
interested. That's good. I'm interested.
Yeah, I'm interested too. I've enjoyed the discussion as well. So yeah, thanks for your time today, James.
Yeah,
and I hope more people look up your article and read it online. Is it available to download? Is it freely accessible on like?
No,
it's not. Oh, okay.
But anyone who has library access can get it. Yeah, I'm sure you can get it through the library, through databases. Anyway, so
yeah, so thanks again for your time, James.
Oh, thanks. I enjoyed it.
If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe.